The Battle of Sugar Point, 1898. Ojibwe versus U.S. Army. Let's have this conversation. On the morning of October 5, 1898, a small group of Ojibwe warriors successfully resisted an assault by approximately 100 soldiers of the United States Army along the shores of Sugar Point. At around 11:30 a.m., the Ojibwe commenced their attack, firing from the cover of the nearby woods. The soldiers, many of whom were inexperienced recruits, took cover on the ground while their officers organized them into a skirmish line around a cabin. This confrontation is often regarded as the final Native American uprising on U.S. territory, known as the Battle of Sugar Point. Two primary factors contributed to this conflict. The first issue involved the exploitation of dead and downed timber by local logging companies. These companies were granted permission to operate within the Leech Lake Reservation and compensated the Ojibwe for the timber they extracted. However, the payments were frequently undervalued and delayed. Funds intended for the Ojibwe, derived from timber sales, were often mismanaged and misappropriated by white Indian agents, leading to wasteful expenditures. There were also allegations that some loggers intentionally set fire to healthy trees to falsely classify them as dead. The second issue pertained to the mistreatment and injustices inflicted by U.S. Marshals and other officials. Whenever a witness or defendant appeared in court in Duluth, individuals were compensated by the U.S. government. The Ojibwe were often unjustly detained and transported to Duluth on fabricated charges. In response to the ongoing mistreatment and the threat to their natural resources, the Pillager Chippewa Band submitted a petition to President William McKinley. The undersigned chiefs and headmen of the Pillager Band of Chippewa Indians of Minnesota respectfully convey that our community is enduring a significant burden. To prevent our people from being overwhelmed by this situation, we earnestly request that you dispatch a commission to investigate the ongoing issues in our region. The Chippewa Indians of Minnesota have consistently demonstrated loyalty to the United States and maintained amicable relations with white settlers, desiring that this friendship remains enduring. Currently, our only means of sustenance and support lies within the pine lands of our reservations, yet the manner in which we are being deprived of these resources has caused us great concern. We have faith that you will safeguard our interests once the facts come to your attention. Unfortunately, the letter received no acknowledgement. Bigon Gesheg, an elder of the Ojibwe community, was among the protesting natives. In April 1898, he was apprehended by a U.S. Marshal on charges of bootlegging and taken to Duluth for court proceedings. After being released due to a lack of evidence, Bigon Gesheg was left to navigate the 135-mile journey home alone. He managed to secure rides on several trains but was repeatedly ejected for lacking a ticket, ultimately forcing him to walk the final 40 miles home, wearing his moccasins down to his bare feet. At that moment, he vowed never to allow himself to be arrested again. However, on September 15th, when he and Shabunde Shekong, another Ojibwe man, visited the nearby native village of Onagam, they were apprehended by the U.S. Deputy Marshal and the U.S. Indian Agent as witnesses to a bootlegging operation, with plans to transport them back to Duluth. Perceiving the imminent threat and wishing to avoid another trip to Duluth, Bigon Gesheg called for assistance. The local Ojibwe community in Onagam, responding to the distress of their elder, successfully liberated the two men. Bigon Gesheg and Shabunde Shekong managed to escape across Leech Lake to Sugar Point. A contingent of 20 soldiers led by Lieutenant Chauncey B. Humphreys was sent to Onagam to engage in discussions with representatives of the Ojibwe tribe. Following the collapse of these negotiations, U.S. scouts proceeded to Bear Island, located just across from Sugar Point. They reported that Bigon Gesheg and his followers were unwilling to surrender, prompting Humphreys to request additional reinforcements. A force of 77 soldiers under Brevet Major Melville Wilkinson accompanied by General John Bacon, was dispatched from Fort Snelling to Walker. The expedition also included U.S. Marshals, Deputy Marshals, Indian police officers, and several journalists. On the morning of October 5th, they embarked on 2 small steamships from a barge. The vessels traversed Leech Lake until they arrived at Sugar Point, where Begongeshig's cabin was situated. Upon disembarking, 2 individuals involved in the escape were identified and apprehended. However, Begongeshig and Shabunda Shekong were not located, having seemingly fled before the troops' arrival. The army conducted a search of the surrounding woods for the Ojibwe who assisted in the escape. After failing to locate anyone, they established a camp. Meanwhile, approximately 20 Ojibwe warriors took up positions in the woods surrounding the cabin. The circumstances surrounding the initiation of the battle have been a subject of contention over the years. The pillagers assert that the soldiers opened fire on a canoe containing 2 women and a child, while the army contends that a soldier inadvertently discharged his weapon. Regardless of the cause, at around 11:30 a.m., a fierce exchange of gunfire erupted between the 2 factions. The Ojibwe commenced firing from the woods, catching the soldiers off guard. Although the soldiers managed to form skirmish lines, they incurred several casualties, including Major Wilkinson, who sustained injuries. The army retreated with the wounded to the cover of the cabin. Wilkinson soon rejoined his men to offer encouragement, but was subsequently shot in the abdomen. He succumbed to his injuries an hour later within the cabin. The conflict persisted into the evening and night hours. Although the frequency of gunfire from the Ojibwe diminished, sporadic shots were still fired throughout the remainder of the day and night. During that night, Indian officer George Russell was reportedly shot accidentally by a soldier who misidentified him as a native individual. The following morning, the army withdrew from Sugar Point and returned to Walker. In this engagement, the Ojibwe incurred no casualties, while the U.S. forces suffered 7 fatalities and 19 injuries. The initial reports of the confrontation incited widespread panic and anxiety. Newspapers propagated exaggerated claims of 100 soldiers killed, describing it as a massacre and a native uprising. Some settlers feared imminent attacks on nearby white settlements. In response, an additional 200 troops equipped with a Gatling gun were dispatched from Fort Snelling to Walker. The Minnesota National Guard was activated, and local settlers formed militias. In Bemidji, residents fortified their homes until a militia from Duluth arrived. Meanwhile, the Ojibwe swiftly retreated from their villages to secluded areas of the reservation. With national attention focused on Leech Lake, the U.S. government was compelled to address the grievances of the Ojibwe people. Commissioner of Indian Affairs William A. Jones was soon sent to the region. After numerous meetings with tribal leaders, a consensus was achieved. Several individuals involved in pillaging surrendered in response to warrants for their arrest. However, none of the warriors who took part in the conflict were apprehended. Begongeshig remained steadfast in his commitment to avoid returning to a U.S. court or prison. Shabunda Shekong was not apprehended either. Most individuals who surrendered served sentences ranging from 2 to 6 months, and shortly thereafter, all those involved received a complete pardon from President McKinley. Following the council's conclusion, Commissioner Jones expressed his disapproval of local and state authorities for what he termed the frequent arrests of Native Americans on minor charges, often without any justification, transporting them to Duluth and Minneapolis for trial, which was 200 miles away from their agency, and subsequently releasing them without resources to return home. Upon his return to Washington, Jones remarked that the Indians' uprising was incited by the injustices they had suffered and their frustration with inequitable treatment. He believed they would return to their homes and live peacefully if treated justly by the white population, which seemed probable as the whites were significantly influenced by the stance taken by the Indians. In this regard, the uprising served as a valuable lesson for them. Subsequently, the situation stabilized, and reforms in the management of timber on the Leech Lake Reservation ultimately resulted in the creation of the Chippewa National Forest. Bigon-Geshig continued to reside in the area for another 18 years before passing away peacefully. The U.S. Army never returned to the shores of Sugar Point on Leech Lake.